Okay, rounded the corner, heading towards home. The lunch has slowed me down. The coffee sped me up. I'm not sure where this is going to go. Welcome to this afternoon. Going to talk a little bit about how all of our planning is moving into implementation mode. So I'm Tim Godwin. I'm from the Department of Water Resources. I serve as an advisor to Deputy Director Paul Gosselin with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Office. I've been working in this space for about 10 years now, and had the fortunate privilege of working with so many of these faces in this crowd, really getting FloodMAR from the starting blocks into implementation. And so it's very exciting to continue to see this group come together and get creative and identify the next big things and talk about our challenges and what's in front of us to really start to build resiliency in California, exercising our groundwater systems, improving our aquatic ecosystems, maintaining our existing agricultural footprints, and really starting to think about this in a different light. How do we re-envision our integrated solutions underneath this changing climate and all the additional pressures that come with managing a resource in the state? It's a big, diverse state. We move water around, and we have a lot of needs. And so balancing that is a very challenging aspect, and I think we have a pretty good panel here that cuts across our agencies and our thought leaders, and really can provide some context in terms of how things are moving forward currently and maybe where we're going to go. So up front, I'd like to acknowledge, do we have slides? There we go. See if we get, okay, we'll start with this. So I just threw together a couple of slides to talk through, and this is from my guests here, that how are we going to approach this? You know, we're moving from plans to progress. And all in the vein of GSP implementation, it's bringing together a lot of voices, and it's been a lot of meeting time. I know a lot of you out there have been in this trench for a while, and we're thinking about this differently now, and I love the creativity. So we're going to have Erik Caderet talk about his experience in conducting recharge and developing plans within the Yolo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, GSA. I guess is that right? So Erik is an assistant GM with Yolo County Flood Control, and he's over a decade in consulting before joining Yolo County, and is an active leader within California Groundwater Association. So really happy that he's here to talk about his experience and knowledge. I forgot you got tricky animations going on, so I got to keep clicking. So Nick Murphey is here from the Nature Conservancy. He's a senior groundwater scientist, and he's really been focusing his work on interconnected surface water and groundwater resource and natural systems and how those two interact. He's been working with us a lot on our guidance document on the depletions of interconnected surface waters, and really supporting the policy development and regulatory implementation aspects and how we can work together to balance these beneficial needs that are out there that rely upon groundwater and those systems. And we have Jacob Byrne from Department of Conservation. He's leading the multi-benefit land repurposing grant programs and really engaged in a wide array of climate resiliency and environmental quality issues as the Department of Conservation is focused on really trying to balance this load and provide those key connections and support it through funding and implementation of some of these actions. So one missing person from our panel here is Tien Tran, and I would be remiss without identifying her. She is an advocate for a lot of our underrepresented communities throughout the valley. You may have heard her a number of times speaking. She's very, very outspoken and gets out there and lets people know what the needs are of our communities that rely upon these resources and how it's impacting them, both from a water supply and a water quantity, or sorry, water quality aspect. She's been a strong advocate for helping us shape our policy and direction for implementing Sigma, and would have been a great voice here. So we've all agreed to try and channel our inner TN throughout our conversation here. So bear with us, and I hope we don't misrepresent her. I'm sure we will. But just to really get started, I think this is going to be conversational, and hopefully it triggers some questions and thoughts from the audience. So we'd love to circle back with you towards the end of this, and really get some input and further the conversation. So one of the leading questions that we've started off with is really thinking about FloodMAR implementation and how it's going. We know the GSPs, and Erik's running one of these, developing one of these, looking towards recharge, and really communicating to the community how this is to be implemented, what it means, how it supports the broader community, how it supports compliance with Sigma, how it supports our ecosystems. What have you experienced from the aspect of misconceptions? Where are people, flying by each other? It seems to be something that occurs rather regularly. So I'll pass it on.
Thank you so much, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone. Misconceptions, there are many, but I'm going to try to focus on just a couple. I think the first thing that really comes to mind very quickly is that how can we do this at scale, right? And the big thing that comes to us a lot is the landowners wanting to be part of the solution, but not exactly knowing how they fit into that solution. And I think part of that comes from stories they hear in other parts of California and just how dire and, bad it can be at times. And there's a lot of fear that tends to come with some of the, decisions that are being made. And so for us, what we're really trying to focus on is in Yolo, we have a unique situation where our groundwater system has, in dry periods when surface water is not available, it is very difficult, to not see the steep decline in groundwater when everyone's pumping. But as soon as we have surface water supplies back, we have precipitation happening, we can see tremendous rebounds in the aquifer system over time. And so we know that we have the capacity to do recharge. We also know that we have the capacity to draw down the groundwater aquifer pretty steeply. So it's talking about the balancing of that and really focusing on, okay, how do we meet the landowner where they're at, talk to them about the costs at their farm field, because the biggest challenge that we have, another misconception is our surface water quality, right? Not everyone here, but for those who do know about Cache Creek, we have boron in our water that comes from Clear Lake. And then we also have challenges of algae and other things. But one of our landowners came to us and said, you know what, I farm in different parts of the state, and I don't think that boron's the biggest issue. I think there are bigger water quality constituent issues in our groundwater versus surface water, and you guys should look into that. So we've been looking into that, and we're realizing, wow, actually, if you look at from the land management perspective, applying fertilizer or managing your crop and looking at the trade-offs between the levels of boron or sodium or other constituents, it actually pencils out potentially to be cheaper if you use surface water versus groundwater, not accounting for the cost of pumping, right? So I think there's this misconception in terms of how do I fit in? What does that mean economically to me? And then the other big thing that is coming up, and I don't think it's unique to Yolo, is as a small farmer, how do I thrive and survive in the future relative to the bigger ag players that might be at play? And that has been playing out very prominently in Yolo, and we're seeing how that's sort of working. And a lot of what we've been focusing on is how do we get folks in the room to keep talking to each other, because as soon as we're not talking to each other, then we're not making progress. And for us, we're trying to emphasize that recharge could be a tool to help us manage the drought periods, but we also have to be cognizant about the realities in the future. And when we get there, we will cross that bridge. And the big thing also is thinking about recharge. And then I'm glad Nick's here because he's working on some of the stuff in many subbasins, but also Yolo. but also thinking about how do we not forget the beneficial uses and users being the environmental side, and how do you also bring that into what you're thinking about in terms of your management decisions. So,
Nick, you want to pile on?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks everyone. My name is Nick Murphey. I'm with the Nature Conservancy, senior groundwater scientist. And in addition to some of the work that Tim flagged, I've also been working a lot on Sigma implementation across the state. So over the past 2 years, we've been working with the Underrepresented Communities Technical Assistance Group, our program, and in partnership with Audubon, we've been engaging in a few groundwater subbasins in the Sacramento Valley, Yolo subbasin, like Erik mentioned, and Vina subbasin. And I think, my background prior to TNC was actually in managed aquifer recharge, and so it's kind of like coming back to an old working group. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces. I did my PhD at UC Davis thinking about nitrate leaching in the Central Valley. And when I remember a few meetings ago, at the third biennial meeting, there is one misconception I think I want to highlight. That was, we were talking about recharge permitting, and there was a feeling of discontent and uncertainty around the fact that water availability needs of recharge projects and ecological protections of functional flows weren't going to butt heads. And there was this feeling that, if you have a high water availability need, there's an inherent disconnect with diverting water off of the river at times that might impact ecological function. And so some folks at TNC, I'm not the lead on this, but some river scientists at TNC, Bronwyn Stanford and Julie Zimmerman, who are part of the California Environmental Flows Framework, have been investigating the relationship between functional flows and flood-mar opportunities. And Bronwyn published a really great California water blog, if you want to go back and read it. It's linked on that QR code through our Groundwater Resources Hub. And it compares some of the traditional recharge permitting pathways to a California Environmental Flows Framework approach. And essentially what it sees is that in a coastal river system, kind of a hypothetical example, using the CEF approach identifies more days available for recharge than the process like the 90/20 permit. And so that is just to say, I think there's a misconception that you can't have your cake and eat it too, but there are creative ways that we can bring to recharge permitting pathways that might result in more water available for diversion while still protecting functional flows. I'll pause there for now and pass it on to Jacob.
Thanks, Nick. I agree kind of with a couple of comments that you both have made so far. I also see sort of a potentially maybe false dichotomy between sort of landowners and farmers and communities, as you're describing for the kind of the environmental field and the habitat focused folks, where I think there sometimes is that base misconception that those two sides, the landowners, the farmers, and the communities, are at diametrically opposed sides of the spectrum. But really, if you can put in the work to kind of prepare both those sides, make sure that both of those sides feel like they're being heard in a joint meeting, you all of a sudden start to really quickly see that there's so much overlap because the landowners are part of the community, and the community is a lot of times working on that land. So that's been one large misconception that I've seen of just that, you can't bring those groups together, but really when you do, you can really find a lot of common ground. And like you said, Erik, once you start talking, you can really start making that progress. And Erik, something else that you mentioned too was, I don't know if this is as much of a misconception or more of kind of areas of unknown that kind of hit the brakes sometimes. A lot of landowners, a lot of producers are really worried about the unknown costs that come from these types of projects, and that can really slow them down. And then while they don't quite know about the costs, they can start identifying different risks that might be introduced. So for instance, for our program, we'll often we see recharge basins maybe with public access tied to them, so a walking path around that recharge basin. Well, this landowner, is not familiar with the risk of public access, but knows there could be a risk of just letting anybody come on and access their property. So you're introducing kind of layers of unknown risk that can sometimes, again, put the brakes on some of these projects.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, I hear what I heard consistently through this is communication is key. It's really about having a solid platform that people can share these ideas, explore solution sets, and then we need those willing landowners to test the environment and really explore what's possible. And I think that's something for this community to think about. How can we support those individual landowners? I know there's a few in here that have already implemented flood-mar projects and taken advantage of some of these opportunities of multi-benefit access. And I think those are really key examples that we can start to articulate more broadly and help local agencies navigate. So speaking of navigating what's next, what are you guys seeing or hearing about how people are overcoming and starting to, support implementation of projects like this? I mean, what have been those tools or opportunities that you think advance the programs? Anybody want to start?
There's so many thoughts with that too. I think the first thing is I just want to recognize all DWR's efforts on all the tools and data that's going out there, because that has been a great starting point to show landowners the technical data and helping them see the opportunities for flood-mar, for example, right? And from my experience on the consulting side, I've been on some projects that failed, right? And you have to consider the risk, and I appreciate you using that word, because I think we don't always think about the risk, but in order to alleviate the risk, you got to show them the data sets that sort of provide the opportunity for that conversation to start about how you can sort of show them. And one example, we worked with the landowner in Yolo, Zamora, and they were aware of the potential risks down the road, allocation, land subsidence, et cetera. So for them, for their perception of risk was, oh, I need to try to participate and I need to understand what I can do as a landowner to help with this solution for flood-mar in order to mitigate my risk down the road. But not every landowner thinks the same way, right? They all think differently. So it's being creative, being nimble, being able to talk to each other about the risks and sort of leveling the playing field around what data and tools are out there to help communicate and ground us on the technical, the social, political, and then the economic realities of those three things having to come together. Because then that really is what gets that landowner, like that one in Yolo, Zamora, to say, yes, go ahead and flood my, my wheat field. And it turned out, I've never seen a field where they were putting a bunch of water on and within 20 feet, it was just gone. It just took the water. We did T10 recently, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, well, that's why. It was just all gravel, basically, and sand down to the water table. And so, like, once you start piecing those things together, then that sort of opens up a pathway to say, you now know that your field could be used for this purpose. Obviously, there's trade-offs. You lost some of your yield on this, and there's an economic cost to that. So then how do we start quantifying and talking about the economic risks, the long-term planning, the finance piece of it, of here's the trade-off between if you do this and what that future could look like versus if you continue doing what you're doing and what that future could look like. And that takes a lot of effort to do those conversations. And so that's been the challenge. And I think every GSA and a lot of agencies, including the NGOs, we spend a lot of time trying to communicate and talk about these things, but we have to be acknowledging of it'll be a very slow start. But I think once momentum builds, and if you get a couple of key influential leaders in the community really taking the lead and then people seeing that working, then I think that momentum can build, and the next thing you know, you can be having really successful programs like we're seeing around the state that are starting to form.
So across the state, or let me back up. A few months ago, the Nature Conservancy updated some of its resources on multi-benefit recharge to identify the priorities and opportunities that we see for ecological benefits to be folded into flood-mar projects. And that's like something we're really excited about, actively looking for partners. And so if you go on our website, you'll see some of these sectors that we've identified potential project opportunities. And that's kind of, people are working on that, but it's really an emerging field. But the challenge is getting to the identification and design of where those projects are needed. And that is kind of a roadblock in the current, as a function of the adaptive management nature of Sigma. So, right now across the state, many GSPs are focused on the identification and mapping of groundwater dependent ecosystems. And I really feel like we need, that's a very important part of the process. But we need to start to move towards impact analyses and understanding how GDEs under Sigma may or may not be impacted, and where we can identify locations that we can mitigate those impacts. And so, we've been working in Yolo thinking about some of these things. We've been thinking about how sustainability management criteria protects GDEs across the subbasin using some recent ecological threshold research that has come out. And so we've really been thinking about the relationship between the shallow groundwater levels that GDEs need and how we can assess changes in those shallow groundwater levels to identify GDEs at risk. And once we begin to identify those areas of risk or areas that streamflow depletion is occurring, then we can begin to take the next step towards those innovative flood-mar projects that start to solve the problems. And so I really think the challenge isn't actually at the flood-mar step yet. It's about getting to the planning stages for these ecologically beneficial projects.
Thank you. So I guess for the multi-benefit land repurposing program, we think about advancing implementation projects in a few different ways. I think we encourage all of our grantees to really look heavily and early at prioritization. I think this kind of gets to your point there, both about kind of what, with using some of the the technical data that we were seeing earlier to say, what parts of our block grant area are most affected by subsidence, what parts is habitat restoration going to be most effective, using that as a basis to then help select those projects, because it really focuses, it takes them from, what can be a somewhat overwhelming issue to really focusing on specific areas that they can then kind of tailor their approach to in a way that's really informed by that location. Once you have that prioritization, then we also encourage folks to start looking at how they can layer benefits within an individual project. What that is looking like in a lot of cases is actual just incentive payments. So you are each of our grantees, as they see fit, can develop an incentive payment structure. So not only are we going to pay for the implementation of the actual program, but you can get compensation for the foregone income. You can get compensation for, you're taking that risk on of public access, or you're doing extra work to foster the habitat restoration on your site. You can accrue further incentive payments to really make sure that you can kind of drive up interest in the program. And then Erik, you mentioned that concept of influential leaders, and so we take that both from to the communities, as well as using influential leaders from the perspective of kind of the projects themselves are those leaders, by making sure that when we are funding a project, that project funding is also coupled with, for instance, kind of like a marketing perspective of, you're going to how are you going to get the information, the results from this project out to the community, so that other folks, other landowners can say, oh, someone down the street did this. I can talk to them about the risks. I can talk to them about what did and didn't work, and it kind of lowers the barrier to entry that way.
That's wow. I was at a round table yesterday, and we were talking about groundwater trading and accounting and how to get moving on these fronts, and helping local agencies reach this point to really driving at this incentive concept, right? How do we incentivize local landowners to take the risk and put those waters on the ground? And I think one of the things that we heard earlier from the state board, this is really challenging in the San Joaquin Valley in particular, where surface waters are really over allocated in many instances. And so they're really trying to find this nexus of capturing these high flows where opportunities exist and get them into the ground. And those opportunities may be fewer and further between. And so that risk may be higher, right? They're not necessarily prepared in that space. So I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about is as we I'm wondering how you all see just incentivizing this process, considering the risk. And well, let's start there. I'll stop. I got lots of.
Actually, it would be helpful if I can go to the slide I had, because I think that really tees this up really nicely. Actually, did I go too far? There we go. All right. So this, first of all, you're going to look at this and be like, Eric, you're nuts. And that's okay. Or you're going to think it's a little too ambitious, and it is. But basically, I wanted to share this with you because it gets to this point of, the risk. And I'll first talk about it briefly about from the district's point of view, but then how that translates to the landowner, in my perspective from what I'm hearing. And so we have been doing the 180-day temporary permits for winter recharge through the state board. And so far, since 2016, we've been able to divert and recharge up to around 40,000 acre feet in a year. However, the face value on that is 72,000 acre feet every single year. And so there is a risk from the district's perspective in that when we file this permit and we go for this face value of this X amount, we may or may not be guaranteed that water. And so some of those years we don't have that water, and that is a sunk cost that is now lost, right? In addition to that, we have operational restraints and considerations. So we have one point of diversion where we can put water through our canals, 160 miles of earthen canals that are primarily have been used as our infrastructure for recharge. And we have capital projects. We have culvert replacements. We have siphons to replace. We have damaged canals. We have a bunch of capital projects we have to do during the off season, which is a limited time window. So then we also are carrying that. And so translating that to the landowner, right? So our ambitious goal is to do flood MAR, and you can see, I mean, these are some astronomical numbers, I get it. But we know we have a lot of acreage we can work with that are connected to the district. But I would assume for a landowner that they're going to think about, okay, if I put in this investment and they're thinking about a 30-year amortization of this project, right? How many years am I actually going to get access to that water? How many years are you going to actually be able to deliver that water to us? So that risk that we take on through our process right now is also being translated down to them. And so that is sort of the trade-off there. But I think if we frame it in terms of the bigger existential risk, which is, and I hate to be the boogeyman, but at the same time, I was meeting with the young farmers and ranchers in Yolo County yesterday, and we were asking them about, what do you want the future of farming to look like? How are you thinking 30, 50 years out from now? And I think we also have to remember that we have a whole next generation of farmers and ranchers that are currently starting, are going to start, that want to see farming continue. And so I think there's this bigger picture, which is a little harder to sell, of how do you get them incentivized for a long period of time and sharing the risk with us, so that way we can achieve the benefits that we want for domestic well owners as long as landowners and the environmental piece of it. Because in reality, if we can do a really good job with a managed aquifer recharge, we will see the benefits downstream of that, right? And that's really going to help through that whole chain. And so our goal is to try to do as much as we can. That would be about 19% of sustainable yield. Will we get there? I don't know, but we're going to try. And I think landowners are a big component of that, and how we operationally work together to make that happen at scale.
Forward to my, thanks. So in terms of incentives, when you look at some of these multi-benefit opportunities that TNC is advocating for, in particular the top ones supporting dry season base flows and groundwater dependent ecosystems, these would be projects that are targeting the shallow aquifer system. And when you think about that, that may mean that the design of that project is not going to be as supply side focused, or not entirely deep aquifer recharge supply side focused as other projects across the state. And so when we're considering these types of projects, we really need incentives and funding mechanisms that will prioritize these multi-benefit projects and identify where there are good places to do them. And although it might seem, counterintuitive, we're obviously very focused on recharge projects for supply side. these types of projects down the road can help reverse stream flow depletion impacts occurring in your basin. They can demonstrate ecological benefits and actually free up funding mechanisms. And so I think like identifying incentivizations for ecologically focused MAR projects, flood MAR projects, is really key to pushing this body of work forward.
I'm so glad I'm the last one on here because I can just keep saying I agree with you too, and build off that. But I think the one thing I'll just repeat is that, Eric, that like that kind of that positive visioning that you were getting at with some of those conversations of there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of kind of it's a huge issue that has really localized impacts, but figuring out ways that you can help folks to vision what is a positive future that we have to look forward to. In the multi-benefit land repurposing plan program, we require all of our grantees to create a plan that kind of includes that sort of what do we want this to look like in 2040 if everything goes right. And I think that does help to unlock gets folks away from feeling like this is something that's being imposed on them and happening to them, and gives them some more agency. It's a small step towards that, but I have seen that work, especially in those discussions where both the producers and the community are in the same discussion. When they start realizing, some of this vision, this continued agricultural production, as well as other benefits, we share this vision. It can really start you just kind of see that light go off, and folks really start becoming a little bit more active.
Yeah, I think that's a great concept is a shared vision for what the future looks like, right? Getting the community to engage in that level. And that kind of brings us to our last question that we laid out here, is really just thinking about community engagement through these planning processes. I wonder if you guys might speak about just what some of the feedback is when discussing the hard aspects of groundwater sustainability planning. What does it mean to move forward in this way? You've already talked about it a little bit, and just how I think sharing that vision and what is your experience. And since we don't have Tien here, I mean, it's really about thinking about the broader community, not just the individual growers or specific aspects that are striving towards that groundwater sustainability, but what does it mean to the community?
Yeah, so that's very much playing out right now in Yolo County, where there are a handful of very concerned citizens about that exact question, about what is sustainability in my area and also the subbasin wide? What does that mean for my future, the community as a whole? And domestic well owners are very much a part of that too, along with the smaller agricultural players there. And there's a real fear about that. But to your point that you made about, we got to talk about how things overlap. And part of that, I think, is just continuing on the communication about, here's our plan going forward, and here's how we're connecting the dots and how we're going to try to bridge these gaps. And just being relentless, really, about how just not giving up that it's going to work. having a very high level of hope and communicating that, and being very consistent about, yes, we hear your concerns. Yes, we understand these are challenges. However, we have to believe that we can actually get there, and the steps we're taking are going to get us there. It may not happen immediately. We may have to make some tough decisions down the road when a drought period comes. We might be caught flat-footed on some things, but we have to believe that we can do this. And I think the big thing is also recognizing that everyone has a role to play, including the bigger players, as well as the domestic well owners, as well as the smaller ag players. And how do we get them all to see that collective vision? And also the environmental groups, where I agree, who can really unlock a lot of different benefits, I think, if we're being creative and thinking about that more. And how can we get that overlay to really be seen by everyone? And I think the biggest challenge with that is there's just a lot of different voices. So being able to, navigate those different voices and filtering them down and trying to come to like a core understanding, and then crafting that message and being consistent with that over time. And just to be honest with you, we're figuring that out still in Yolo. But we know we have to go there, but we know we're trying, we're making progress. And a lot of other people I think are in the same boat or in a similar boat, and just believing that we can get there and not giving up on that.
Just before I joined TNC, a report came out that looked at the outcomes related to stakeholder integration in Sigma decision making and GSP development processes related to outcomes important for underrepresented communities, so domestic wells, small farmers, and the environmental beneficial users, groundwater dependent ecosystems. And we saw pretty clearly that when you increase your stakeholder integration in GSP development processes, the outcomes for those underrepresented groups are much stronger. And so, I mean, I think the science kind of speaks for itself, but I also acknowledge that it's not an easy process. We've been doing it on the ground with environmental stakeholders in Yolo and in Vina, and it's a lot of science communication, a lot of helping them understand the tools we're using to evaluate things like the presence of groundwater dependent ecosystems compared to their real world lived examples. But at the same time, in many ways, these stakeholders are the experts in their subbasin. They know the landscape very intimately. They can point to a map that we have and say, oh, this is or this isn't a GDE based on, my lived experience in the area. Or you show that this riparian polygon that we think is a GDE has had negative health impacts, but in reality a big flood came in and actually just wiped it out. It's not like related to groundwater levels, and that type of on the ground truthing of our technical tools has been a huge learning experience for me. So I just think it's like one of the most important processes when we think about future adaptive management and GSP development.
Yeah, I think kind of doing that community vision and bringing people together to talk about these issues is, to me, the hardest part of a lot of this work. I think Stephanie earlier today talked about, some of her, proposing different solutions and proposing things that she she thought would work, and just getting yelled at, for an entire public meeting. And we've had grantees that come back to us and say, hey, we did that public meeting you told us to do, and we just got torn apart, and it was a terrible time. And, you just have to, that just happens sometimes, and you have to just kind of, you have to realize that although it seems very personal in the moment, it's personal for them, but it's not personal towards you. And find a way to kind of, look at what's driving that. So in a lot of times it's anger that, people feel like they're being forced to change their way of lives, and the government is coming and telling them what to do with their land. A lot of times it's coming from uncertainty that we've talked about already, whether that's uncertainty in their livelihoods or uncertainty for the future of their community. And then differing levels of expertise too. People can start to feel left out because, maybe there's not the same language access for all of your community members. Maybe there's language access, but it's not someone who knows what Sigma is. And so it's really, you have to go from, you have people who are, pretty much experts and people who don't know anything. And you're trying to get them to come together and do this visioning all in this really kind of heightened level of stress. And so where we have seen success is just making sure that process is taken very slowly. So sometimes that means, you are starting in silos, you're meeting with individual stakeholder groups, you're making sure everybody understands the basics of the discussion before you're taking people together and mixing them up and then doing that visioning process. In other places, it's going to mean you throw everybody together because they all kind of are used to this sort of discussion or have been primed for it. But I think it's just the hardest part of the whole thing, and the solution in each community is going to be quite different. But I think really slowing down and thoughtfully laying out a path can really help.
This has been great. I've heard a lot of things that I think are resonating here, about the trial and error, the local expertise, the experience of putting water on the ground and seeing what happens. And I think that's tremendously valuable to start with this incentivization that it's possible. And I know the department has been challenged with a recent bill for the California Water Plant to really step up the game in terms of evaluating where recharge is occurring, how it can occur. We're going to hear a lot about that tomorrow from our watershed team. And I think having these pieces out there can really help to provide that incentive, that this is possible. I really like this concept of the positive visioning. I mean, that's something we need to do better at, so people can see that there is a view of what is possible out there, and then we need to put those pieces together to get to those conditions. One of the things that we discussed very quickly is the funding aspect, right? It's very challenging right now with state funding. However, we have Prop 4 right around the corner. So, I mean, I know Jacob can talk a little bit about where that may be going. But I think that's also something that I'd really like to ask the audience in terms of what they think. How do we provide these funding mechanisms to support the actions of the GSA, to support TNC and continuing to engage and support our ecosystems and the natural systems that are out there that don't have that voice necessarily? How do we really get to that multi-benefit aspect? And I think those are big ticket items. So I don't know, Jacob, if you want to talk a little bit about kind of where MLRP might be heading with this latest tranche of funding, or any thoughts the rest of you may have in terms of how we might wrestle funding to the ground a little bit more.
Yeah. So I was just talking about this with someone during our lunch break too, and we are very happy that MLRP was included in Proposition 4, the climate bond. So it'll be expanding, but with $200 million worth of new funding. But $200 million in the face of the issues that we have is it's a small drop in this bucket that we're facing. However, I think some of the solutions and some of the progress that we're going to be making through that small contribution, I think we'll be able to scale up, and that's why again we are often thinking about all of our implementation projects as demonstration projects, all of our plans as demonstration plans, and trying to figure out how we can come to events like this and really put out more information about the program, about here's the lessons that we've learned, so that other places that we can't quite touch with that funding are able to learn from our experiments and experiences, and hopefully do it better in a way that makes sense for their local context. But we are looking forward to putting out some new funding. You'll be hearing a little bit more about that tomorrow. But yeah, we hope to. I hope to be talking to a lot more of you in 2026 about new funding opportunities.
I think in order to attract more funding to tackle this challenge and to really achieve things at scale, I think we need to be talking more about the win-wins and getting away from the us versus them mentality, because that tends to be where we start sometimes, and that's okay. There's room and space for that, but then we have to, highlight the successes, bring in the groups that we don't normally think to go to, right? I know there's a ton of money out there that the environmental groups would like to put to use in productive ways. Even though it might not be popular, the tech sector is very interested in doing that too. And I think that the more we can communicate and message the opportunity that is presenting itself, and then the opportunity cost if we don't take this opportunity, then we are not doing ourselves the best favor to try to bolster funding towards MLRP or other initiatives to try to do that. And, I think that this is not a knock on anyone, this is a knock on me, also myself, which is that I think the water industry has growth to do in terms of marketing ourselves to make that happen. And I'm not a marketing person, so I'm not the person to ask how to do that. But I think there's a really good opportunity for us to put our heads together and to try to really make that point home and really attract the investments that are needed to support everything to work together so we can all win-win with the minimal losses in the end.
I'll just really quickly say that in addition to funding streams for project design and implementation, we also really need science funding streams. Understanding the science behind flood-mar, connections to those ecosystem services that I've talked about today. There's some really exciting science questions, and we need to be doing the science work in parallel with the implementation and flood-mar work in order to answer those questions and become better advocates for recharge processes or best management practices.
Well, I'll take this chance to say thank you to our speakers. I think this is a great cross-section of some of the challenges of moving from a planning phase and really getting to implementation, that we are just starting to dip our toe into this sector, and we have a long way to go. And to echo Graham, I think we need thousands of farms and lands looking at taking advantage of floodwaters, putting them out there, testing the situation, being cognizant of the risks that are out there, but helping to paint that picture of that shared vision for what the future can be, to build out the resiliency and really enable us to store more water. Our climate's changing. We're having a different hydrology. We have a system that's built on a past hydrology, and we need to adapt. So here we are, and I think we have good creative folks on the ground trying to get from plans to implementation. And I think that's the key push for us in the coming years, is how do we get more wheat fields losing water at a rate that you can't keep up with, right? And I think those opportunities are going to shift our thought process in terms of what is farming. I mean, farming may be more than just growing an agricultural product. You may be farming water, right? So you may look at what available resources you have for your groundwater systems and how that might support these beneficial uses, and it may not pencil out. Especially, I know we have those issues in the San Joaquin Valley. We need to shift that thinking to really take advantage of those opportunities where they're observed, where we are seeing these conditions, and expand upon those to really develop that shared vision. We need to leverage the funding that's coming out of DOC as well as the department, whatever funding mechanisms we have coming down the pike to support implementation. So I encourage all of you to stay engaged as you all are, and really help paint that shared vision so implementation becomes a reality, and we can start to see measurable results. So I think we have a little bit of time for some questions, maybe? If there's any.
I'm coming with the mic. I see one hand over there, but I also see you, Graham, so you can be second.
This one? Okay. Thanks so much for the panel. One thing I find myself thinking more and more about that I haven't heard discussed is whether there's very much regional coordination when it comes to making investments in infrastructure or programs to support recharge. So you may have like two neighboring GSAs, for example, that both want to do a lot of recharge. They want to capture a lot of water, and they might be talking about the same water, right? So there might be some conflict there. And those GSAs may make investments into that and may end up not getting anything out of it because their neighbor is going after that same water. So I'm just wondering if anyone's thinking about that, and if you have any thoughts on regional conflict.
That's a perfect question, because I was asking Tim if we can talk about it a little bit more. Yeah, there's a lot of regional coordination going on in the two things that are happening in Yolo and Calusa right now. One is the Sac Valley, blanking on the flood diversion, recharge, enhancement work group. Yeah, I always get the acronym wrong when I'm thinking about it in my head. But that's being led by DWR and partners, including the GSAs, the water agencies, really thinking about how do we create a regional, coordination amongst each other to really try to maximize the recharge flood mar in the Sac Valley region, so that we can solve a regional problem, which is subsidence for us, right? And thinking about that together. But then on top of that, there's a more local grassroots group being headed up by Jordan Navarro, who was here earlier, and it's the South Calusa North Yolo group, and they're doing a really awesome concept right now of getting those landowners in both subbasins to voluntarily come together and put their resources into a pool of funds, so that way they can work together to get water to those fields and those basins that they're currently working on, to get water in the ground right now, as soon as possible. And the reason why that's such an incentive is because Calusa has the 2027 deadline of a demand management program having to start up in some way, shape, or form. And that is the big incentive for those groups of folks who would like to optimize the recharge piece to then better understand how do we do an allocation system in the future and what does that look like. So that's been the incentive there. And then in North Yolo, in the Yolo subbasin, the district has, and the YSJ have a different project that's more south of the Skinny Group, but it's also, we're coordinating with them and talking with Dunnigan Water District, RD108 and others, talking about how do we take a groundwater only area and how do we bring surface water to those areas as one way to try to tackle that regional problem in a more focused area, but in conjunction with this regional concept. But then on top of that, how do we then also try to optimize recharge opportunities, that go beyond just surface water, right? Because we could bring in surface water, but 8 out of 10 years or 7 out of 10 years that it's there. But for those 2 to 3 out of 10 years when everyone's going to be pumping, we're still going to run into an issue. So we have to also be thinking about, how do we balance out the system, but then also thinking about the future of how do we then manage that going forward. So that's just one area that's doing it. And I know that down south in San Joaquin Valley, there are other initiatives also forming and happening right now where there are multiple subbasins working together.
And I'll just briefly add to that. It doesn't directly speak to this question or this issue, but one aspect of MLRP that we're seeing come out that the grantees really benefit from is what they call kind of a community of practice. So these folks, the GSAs, the community-based organizations, starting to work together organically because they're all running into similar issues and able to kind of connect. Either will facilitate that connection, or in a meeting altogether, someone will say, I've got a recharge project that needs habitat restoration, and another grantee will say, I just did that, let's connect. And you just get this really organic kind of mixing and matching. So it's not quite to that level that you're talking about this specific issue, but as more folks kind of start to work on these problems, that cross-pollination and cross-learning has been really effective and kind of an unintended but very positive consequence of our program.
I'll just pile on just a little bit more. San Joaquin Valley, Laura here with the San Joaquin Valley Collaborative Action Plan and the work she's doing there. There's also the blueprint process, which is developing a unified plan. Some of that stuff's starting to come out. So there is some coordination going on, really looking at that double counting of water and how they can collectively come together and, not trip each other up to get to maximizing the resource that's available. One last aspect I want to highlight, and Sigma, I'd say, put a wrinkle in this program's pathway, is the Integrated Regional Water Management Program. That's an existing program that's been out there that has started and founded on a regional basis, pulling together a lot of different agencies. I believe that IRWM is going to have a resurgence and come together to really help GSAs pull together and start to look more regionally at the resources that are available and how best to manage them.
Thanks for an interesting discussion. There's recurring themes that keep coming up, and one of which is there's not enough money to do what we want to do. The other recurring theme is how do we incentivize people to recharge, especially when their recharge benefits their neighbors, in many cases more than them. Another one that keeps coming up, although I didn't hear it so much here, is the issue of incentivizing demand control in a transparent, fair way. I'm convinced I know of a solution for those things, but I'm not going to claim that I think it's feasible to implement yet. But I think to implement what I'm going to suggest requires the changing of cultures. Those cultures, I've seen them change on the coast, examples being Orange County, Pajaro Valley. They've changed there, but not so much in the interior of the Central Valley. So what I'm going to suggest is simple, and I've said it before. I think it's going to be very difficult, even with Sigma, to control demand the way you want and as much as you want until people are paying pumping fees by how much they pump. That's something that's the stickiest cultural change to happen in the interior of California. Not on the coast, because the coasts have already been battered with seawater intrusion. They already know. of limits and what it means to be in the same boat together. The other one is people need to be paid back by how much they recharge. Those pumping fees should also be designed and implemented to make the GSAs financially independent. So to me, those three things, pumping fees, recharge rebates, and a system that manages that would be the holy grail of management. And again, I'm not saying, we can be hand-wringing about this. Oh, well, we can't do that yet because people get so pissed off when we talk about things like pumping fees. So what we should be thinking of is, well, how do we move the culture, the water culture of those parts of the state that would be against those things, little by little, year by year, to the point where those sustainable financial economic solutions could be implementable. But let's be realistic. The time perhaps is not ripe for them to happen now, maybe in some places.
Two quick thoughts on that, Graham. Those are interesting points, and I agree with you on much of it. I think one thing to consider is like the innovation that's happening in those places that have water use fees, like the ReNem project, the recharge net metering in Pajaro. That's not really possible right now to expand to areas that don't have pumping fees. And by implementing, we would see that innovative program grow. The other thing you mentioned about GSAs being financially independent, when we were working on technical assistance for environmental beneficial users, GSAs often express they're strapped for time and technical expertise and money, and so finding a path forward to make them financially independent might allow them to have more staff on hand to do these technical analyses and actually grow their own in-house capabilities to do some of these things that right now they rely on external funding or external consultants for.
No, I appreciate that. I think I have two just quick comments on that. In order to do that successfully, I think you need a really solid data set and tools to be able to manage that. And from a GSA perspective, the administrative cost could be high, depending on what tools and innovations you're using to really alleviate the paperwork and the burden of that. So that's like the one thing that I know will only get better over time, right? And I know a lot of it's happening, and I think there will be this trickle-down effect over time to where as we get more advanced and as the cost of those things come down to be able to do it efficiently, it'll then be able to translate over to the GSAs. But I think that, the thing that I personally see and something that I charge myself to work on has been when we're talking about fees, usually when we're doing that with the fee study, right, we're talking about a 5-year budget, but we're not talking about in the longer term 30-year business planning cycle and how that all fits together. And I think that is something that, I would like to see our YSGA thinking about, is because I think that's going to help us then translate what the future could be, whatever that is. Then how does this current fee that we're talking about right now translate to the 30-year time horizon with the uncertainties baked into it, right? Because then at that point, then I think in my mind, we're speaking more to how the landowners are managing their land and also planning their crops and how they're managing all their costs, because for them, they're at the mercy of the commodity market, right? And that is a longer time horizon you got to plan for. And so how do we get to that level of helping them understand that so that way they can then get on board?
More? Okay, let's go.
Whoa, okay. Maybe this question is for Nick specifically. I'm thinking about what are the challenges and opportunities that you see as a group that is producing new science and new tools, and how that actually gets uptaken by consultants and by agencies and folks who are implementing. You guys are pushing on the cutting edge, and then how are you seeing that get implemented and adopted?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So on our part, a lot of it is the need to do effective science communication about how the tools and methods and workflows can be used. But I think a priority for us going forward is to work with state agencies to develop guidance that then is co-signed and passed out to GSAs, because really, GSAs are looking to the state for what's required of them, especially when you consider like GDE considerations or impacts to environmental beneficial users. And so when we can align on that and co-develop guidance products or best management practices, that can allow for increased implementation at the sub-basin scale.
I think we're pretty much out of time. I'm looking at Megan. So please join me in thanking our panelists. I think this is a great discussion.